Chen Ping'an stumbled out of the room with a dazed expression and made his way out into the yard. He looked up at the scorching sun, and it was a bright and clear day with not a single cloud in the sky. Chen Ping'an could feel that his own breathing was a little labored, so he sat down onto the doorstep and joined his palms together as he focused on meditation. Only after around 15 minutes had passed did the obstruction in his breathing fade away, but right as he was about to stand up, he caught a glimpse of something out of his peripheral vision, causing him to immediately sit back down onto the doorstep. His eyes widened with disbelief as he turned toward a corner of his yard, where a slab of dragon-slaying platform was resting peacefully. He hurriedly rose to his feet and rushed over to the slab of dragon-slaying platform, then crouched down to examine it carefully. As he examined the slab of dragon-slaying platform, he was struck by a sense of familiarity. He stroked his own chin as he slowly made his way around the piece of dragon-slaying platform, and after making a full lap around the stone, he was convinced that this was a piece of the pedestal beneath the nodding bodhisattva statue. However, it looked as if this chunk of the pedestal had been sliced off extremely cleanly, much like a piece of tofu, and a shiver immediately ran down his spine as he made this observation. Ningyao was always making bold claims to Chen Ping'an, but she had never once lied to him. She had told him that dragon-slaying platform was an extremely hard material that could only be sliced through by a powerful sword immortal at a heavy cost. Chen Ping'an firmly believed what she had told him, and thus, he was absolutely bewildered by the fact that a piece of a pedestal had somehow ended up in his yard. Could it be that the slab of dragon-slaying platform had come to life and rolled into his yard on its own? At this point, Chen Ping'an was already aware that there were mystical forces in this world, but surely there were no living stones. Besides, it could have gone to any house it wanted. Why would it have come to him? To suffer? If so, then this thing really had to be as dumb as a rock. Hey, can you speak? Can you understand what I'm saying? Chen Ping'an asked in a tentative voice. To no one's surprise, he was met with no response. Chen Ping'an continued to stare at the piece of dragon-slaying platform with a bewildered expression. The dream from earlier was so realistic that Chen Ping'an was still yet to fully return to the real world, which was why he was still quite jumpy and jittery. Many trivial things that he had never put much thought into were suddenly flooding back into his mind, and he was able to see them through different eyes. Both Mr. Qi and Ning Yao had told him many things about the strange world outside of the town, and even old man Yao had told him many stories. There were many things that had to be taken into account, even when it came to something as simple as entering the mountains. For example, those unremarkable old tree stumps could be seats that belonged to mountain gods, so it was taboo to sit on them. Old man Yao had proclaimed that all of the mountains in the world, regardless of how short or tall they were, came from the same roots, and that they were all related to one another, much like members of a human clan. In this instant, a hint of curiosity suddenly welled up in Chen Ping'an's heart. He really wanted to know what he had to do if he wanted to see the entirety of Zhuhou's small world. Would he have to climb to the peak of that mountain that was even taller than Cloud Drape Mountain to be able to see everything? Chen Ping'an set that train of thought aside as he continued to stare at the black stone, and he was considering moving it to the blacksmith shop as it would definitely come in useful for Ning Yao. As for what Ning Yao was going to do with the stone, whether that be using it to sharpen her own sword, or pass it on to Master Ruan as thanks for forging a sword for her, that didn't matter to Chen Ping'an. He was only curious about how one could go about sharpening their sword on this stone, and he wondered if it was the same process that he used to sharpen his bushcraft blades. Chen Ping'an was never one to procrastinate, so after making his decision, he immediately sprang into action. He gripped onto the underside of the stone with his hands and hoisted it upward, but was only able to lift it around an inch up from the ground. It was rather heavy, but not so heavy that it was immovable. Chen Ping'an returned to the house to find a basket, and soon, he was making his way down Clay Vase Alley with the basket on his back, and a garment draped over the dragon-slaying platform sitting in the basket. After leaving Clay Vase Alley, Chen Ping'an noticed that there were many people on the streets. It was most likely because everyone had been thoroughly spooked by the sudden transition from day to night, and now that the sun had reappeared, they were all coming out to bask in its radiance. The vast majority of the town's residents had emerged from their homes and made their way out onto the streets to discuss the recent eclipse. Occasionally, there would be someone rushing past, proclaiming that the Iron Lock well had completely run dry, and that even the metal chain that had been hanging in the well for as long as anyone could remember had been taken by someone. There were also some rabble-rousing children who were jumping around with excited expressions, telling stories about what had happened to the old locust tree. As it turned out, the old locust tree had been uprooted and was laying on the street with snapped branches and yellow leaves all around it. Many of the town's nearby residents felt this to be quite a waste, and they picked up some branches and leaves to use as kindling and firewood. Some reluctant young men had also been urged by their wives to go out with their hatchets to cut off some of the thicker branches of the tree. This was not met with no opposition. Many of the elderly people who had lived their entire lives around the old locust tree were absolutely distraught, hurling torrents of abuse at the people who were benefiting from the tree's demise, while others were lecturing people on the history of the old locust tree, proclaiming that it was a sentient entity. Throughout all these years, it had only shed branches late at night to avoid having those branches fall onto people's heads, and during years of lean harvests, the old locust tree always stepped up, producing countless locust flowers to fill the bellies of many. However, their efforts were all to no avail. The young men ignored what they were being told, continuing to cut branches off the tree, and some of the more short-tempered ones among them had even gotten into shoving matches with their elderly detractors, creating a rather chaotic scene. After hearing about what had happened to the old locust tree, Chen Ping'an became rather hesitant about how to proceed, stopping in his tracks once every few steps to look in the old locust tree's direction. His instincts told him that he should go and take a look, but there was a voice in his heart urging him to go to the blacksmith shop as quickly as possible. All of a sudden, a short and sprightly figure blew past him like the wind. It was a little girl wearing a large padded jacket, and what was quite amusing was that she was carrying a branch as thick as a young man's arm on her shoulder. The branch was as long as she was tall, and she was rushing along so quickly that it was as if there were wheels attached to her feet. Chen Ping'an immediately identified her as the little girl who liked to keep to herself and wander around the town as fast as the wind. She and Gu Qin had gotten to know each other through an altercation, and Chen Ping'an had met her not long ago at the Azure Cow Ridge. She was also around those mystical figures, and she seemed to be particularly close with that young Taoist nun. Chen Ping'an recalled that he had given her a small snake gall pebble in the past. Chen Ping'an hurriedly called out to her, and she turned around to face him. Upon catching sight of him, a flash of recognition appeared on her face along with a bright smile. Her eyes seemed to be capable of speaking, and at this moment they looked as if they were saying, "What do you want? I'm listening. I'm in a hurry, so make it quick." Chen Ping'an held back the urge to laugh as he beckoned to her and said, "I have something to discuss with you. It won't take long." The little girl immediately rushed over to him with the branch still hoisted on her shoulder, then turned slightly to the side and raised her head with an inquisitive expression. "You got this branch from the old locust tree, right?" Chen Ping'an asked. The little girl nodded vigorously in response, and a slightly forlorn look appeared on her face as she said, "I have to be fast. Otherwise, all of the branches will be gone. I'm only strong enough to carry a branch this size, so I want to make as many trips as possible." Chen Ping'an's mind was racing as he said, "Your house is on Fortune Street, right? That's really far away. If you trust me, you can put the locust branch in my yard. That way, you'll be able to make a few more trips than if you were to go home every time." The little girl weighed up her options in silence, and while considering the proposal, she was also observing Chen Ping'an's expression. After a while, she seemed to have decided that Chen Ping'an didn't have any sinister intentions, so she nodded in response. "What do you want me to do for you in exchange? Let me make this clear. I won't be able to carry any branches larger than this. These things are very heavy, and I already feel like my shoulder's on fire." Chen Ping'an pulled out a string of keys, then plucked off one of them before handing it to the little girl. "This is the key to my yard gate. I don't need you to do much for me. Just keep a lookout for any green leaves that haven't turned yellow yet while you're fetching branches. If you spot any, make sure to keep them for me." "That's it?" the little girl asked as her eyes widened in surprise. Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "That's it. You know where my house is, right?" The little girl nodded in response. "It's the 12th house on the left-hand side of Clay Vase Alley." However, she didn't take the key that was being offered to her. "The wall of your yard isn't very tall, so I can just drop the branches over the wall without opening the yard gate." Chen Ping'an put the key away upon hearing this, and at that point, the little girl was already far away. After parting ways with the little girl, Chen Ping'an made his way out of the town and traveled southward. As he approached the covered bridge, he was shocked to discover that it was gone, having reverted back to the old stone bridge in his memories. Even though the covered bridge was much more spectacular and had a shimmering golden plaque hanging above it, for some reason, Chen Ping'an still preferred the old stone bridge. Standing on one end of the bridge, Chen Ping'an suddenly thought of that inexplicable dream he had, and he took a deep breath as he slowly made his way up the slant. The closer he drew to the center of the bridge, the more nervous he became. He was already sweating profusely, and his anxiety certainly wasn't helping in that regard. However, he was able to make it all the way to the end of the bridge without anything happening, and a self-deprecating smile appeared on his face as he sped up on his way to the blacksmith shop. Over at the Azure Cow Ridge, Old Man Yang was seated on the edge of the bluestone cliff, puffing on his old pipe. The pool of water beneath his feet was shimmering and rippling incessantly, and there seemed to be large clumps of aquatic plants swaying beneath the surface. Even under the light of the sun, the aquatic plants still gave off an inexplicable sense of unsettling eeriness. The blurry face of an old woman gradually appeared on the surface of the water. The woman had a head of dark green hair, presenting a harrowing sight to behold, and she said in a trembling voice, "Esteemed immortal, I tried to approach that side last night, but I simply couldn't. I made many attempts, but each time, I felt as if I had been plunged into a cauldron of hot oil, and the pain was too severe for me to continue. Please spare me, esteemed immortal, this is an impossible task for me." A cold look appeared on Old Man Yang's face as he said, "I'm not here to punish you. From now on, just make sure to do everything within the realm of your capabilities, that'll suffice. I came here because I have an extremely rare opportunity for you, and it's up to you whether you dare to fight for it or not." The old woman's green face was rippling eerily with the water around her, and she immediately put on an earnest and focused expression to hear what Old Man Yang was about to say next. Old Man Yang continued, "At this point, this small world is already slowly falling back to the mortal realm to be reintegrated with the earth. At the moment, it's at a very important stage in this process, and it won't be long before the small world becomes connected to the Greatly Empire. Here, you are only known as a river guardian as opposed to a river god, just like the informal officials of the mortal empires. It seems to be only a slight difference, but the difference is night and day." He pointed his pipe in the direction of the stone bridge as he continued, "The reason for this isn't because the territory under your jurisdiction is too small. Instead, it's because your territory has been severed. You see that bridge over there? That thing is what's placing this limit on you. All you have to do is swim under the bridge, and you'll have a bright future ahead. This small creek that you're in right now will become the origin of many important rivers in the future, and once that happens, not only will you be sure to attain the river god status and have your hair extend to hundreds of kilometers in length, it'll be entirely possible for you to become a great river god with your hair extending to thousands of kilometers in length." The old woman was clearly very tempted by this prospect. Old Man Yang didn't try to rush her, smiling as he continued, "Then again, it's quite comfortable to just lay in the mud and do nothing, isn't it? Why strive for higher aspirations?" The old woman's heart immediately sank slightly as she listened to Old Man Yang's thinly veiled insult, and she hurriedly begged for mercy, causing the water in the creek to tumble and churn incessantly. Old Man Yang remained unmoved as he said in an indifferent voice, "It's up to you whether you want to continue to be a pitiful catfish or transform into a flood dragon that controls the fate of the water. Also, don't forget what I told you before. If you choose to go down this path, then there's no turning back. You have to follow it to the end. There's nothing in this world that can grant you eternal blessings. You might not like to hear this, but to be frank, you are the last one in this town that deserves good karma." The more aloof and indifferent Old Man Yang appeared, the more uneasy the old woman became, and in the end, she gritted her teeth with a determined expression before quickly plunging into the water. Moments later, she completely vanished into the water, but a green shadow could be seen swimming downward in a zigzag fashion in the water between the Azure Cow Ridge and the stone bridge. As the shadow approached the stone bridge, it slowed down further and further, and by the end it had slowed to a crawl. Less than 100 feet away from the bridge, the green shadow abruptly began to accelerate, clearly making a last-ditch effort to get to the other side. The old woman passed through without any obstruction, and after rushing several hundred feet past the stone bridge, she couldn't help but twirl around in the water in excitement, causing her hair to wind around her wizened and fleshless body. She floated in the water of the creek, raising her head to look up at the stone bridge, and she was finally able to see the old sword billet. It was still as rusty as ever and looked no different from back when she was a child. However, in the next instant, her eyeballs suddenly exploded, all because her gaze had lingered on the old sword billet for a moment too long. An agonized howl rang out as water splashed and churned. After a long while, the water in the creek finally settled down, and at this point the old woman had already regrown a pair of eyes, but her aura had become very feeble, and Old Man Yang's voice rang out beside her ears once again. You're already extremely fortunate to have been granted free passage, so don't push your luck. Remember not to raise your head when you pass by the stone bridge in the future. I'll make sure to remember, the old woman hurriedly said in an obedient voice. Even though Chan Ping'an had a thin and frail-looking body, he wasn't struggling at all as he carried the locust branches on his shoulder, making his way down Clay Vase Alley as if there were nothing more than a feather sitting on his shoulder. Li Baoping was trailing along behind him, and she was astonished to see this. If it weren't for her insistence, Chan Ping'an would have taken the locust branch on her delicate shoulder as well. At the entrance to Clay Vase Alley stood a little girl with her hair arranged into a pair of braids. Her cheeks were bright red from the cold winter air, and upon spotting Li Baoping swaggering her way down the alley, a displeased look appeared on her face as she complained, Li Baoping, didn't you say you were going to come to school with me after dropping off the locust branch? Grandpa Ma is acting really strange today. He's dressed up like Mr. Qi, and he says that he'll be taking us on our excursion to Mountain Cliff Academy. If Grandpa Ma gets mad at us, then we'll all pin the blame on you. Li Baoping didn't take her words to heart at all, and she pulled one of the green locust leaves that Chan Ping'an had given her out of her embroidered pouch, twirling it gleefully in front of the other girl with an expression that said, You don't have any of these, do you? I have a load of them. The little girl with the twin braids was very bemused, perplexed about why Li Baoping was showing off a leaf to her. However, she was very disgruntled by Li Baoping's gloating expression, and she really wanted to slap that smug look off her face. The problem was that none of the children in the school, even a troublemaker like Li Huai, was a match for Li Baoping in a fight. Li Huai had once been beaten by Li Baoping to the point that he laid on the ground and pretended to be dead. However, Li Baoping was still unwilling to let him off the hook, and she stripped off Li Huai's pants, then tossed them high up onto a tree branch. Li Huai was bawling his eyes out as he rushed back home with no pants, and his mother was not one to let bygones be bygones. Thus, she dragged Li Huai along behind her as she stormed onto Fortune Street. However, as soon as she spotted the fearsome stone lions and tall walls of the Li clan's manor on Fortune Street, she immediately directed her rage at Li Huai instead, giving him a vicious beating. In the end, she didn't even dare to knock on the gate of the Li clan's manor, and she scurried back to their dilapidated house on the westernmost side of the town while dragging Li Huai along by the ear. However, in order to console her son, Li Huai's mother killed a chicken and braised it for him to eat that night. Li Huai stood on his stool with his backside still bare, swaying from side to side as he munched happily on the chicken, and the embarrassment that he had suffered at the hands of Li Baoping had become nothing more than a constant memory. A disdainful look appeared on the face of the little girl with the twin braids, and she scoffed, Why are you showing off a dumb leaf? My father gave me a golden abacus last night. It's made of gold, and it's this big. Unfortunately for her, Li Baoping was still completely immersed in her own little world, and she didn't care about any golden abacus in the slightest. She continued to twirl the locust leaf in front of the little girl with her pointy little chin raised in provocation, and she pointed at Chan Ping'an as she said, He gave this to me. I still have more in this pouch. The little girl with the twin braids heaved an exasperated sigh. Li Baoping had always been this annoying since the very first day they had met. She always said and did what she wanted without any regard for anyone else. If it weren't for the fact that there weren't many children of her age on Dragon Riding Alley, she would have never sought out Li Baoping as a playmate. It was often the case that even Mr. Qi was left completely stumped and exasperated by Li Baoping. She would always ask some strange questions in class, and Mr. Qi would always try to answer those questions seriously. The only problem was that the answers that he provided were often not satisfactory to Li Baoping. Sometimes Mr. Qi would spend a long time mulling over a question that she had raised, and he would excitedly provide an answer to her the next day, only to find that she had already forgotten all about what she had asked the previous day. Whenever she thought about activities like fishing for catfish, fighting crickets, or flying kites, she would immediately rush away in excitement, leaving Mr. Qi hanging high and dry. Chen Ping'an was carrying a bunch of locust branches on his shoulder, so it was difficult for him to turn his head. Thus, he could only raise his voice slightly as he asked, "How many people are in the school right now?" Meanwhile, Li Baoping was arduously moving her locust branch to her other shoulder. She had already transferred the branch back and forth from shoulder to shoulder many times, and both of her shoulders were feeling very sore. The little girl with the twin braids extended a hand forward as she replied, "There are only 5 people left. Me, Li Baoping, Li Huailin Shuyi, and Dongshui Jing." She had nothing better to do anyway, so she eagerly told Chen Ping'an about the current situation in the school. Mr. Qi promised to take us on an excursion to Mountain Cliff Academy before. At the time, there were still around 15 kids at the school, and their parents and guardians all agreed for them to go on the excursion. But after that, most of the rich kids living on Fortune Street and Peach Leaf Alley stopped coming to school because they were sick, and I heard from Li Baoping that they later left the town altogether to go live with distant relatives. They were the happiest out of everyone when they first heard about the excursion to Mountain Cliff Academy, and I had no idea what they were so happy about. I get tired just thinking about having to go somewhere so far away with Mr. Qi. The little girl's voice was quite tender, but her logic was very clear, and she spoke with an adult-like sense of maturity and calmness. For some reason, Chen Ping'an was reminded of Gu Kan, but she was quite different from that abrasive troublemaker. "What's your name?" Chen Ping'an asked with a smile. The little girl with the twin braids replied, "My name is Shi Chuanjia. You can call me Madam Shi." Chen Ping'an was rendered speechless upon hearing this. "You can just call her Little Rock," Li Baoping scoffed. Shi Chuanjia immediately turned to Li Baoping like an enraged kitten as she protested. "You can't call me Little Rock. You're not allowed to either, Li Baoping." However, at this point, Li Baoping had already wandered away from the subject of Shi Chuanjia's nickname, so she completely ignored her protests. However, Shi Chuanjia had a very persistent personality, and she seemed to have endless patience as she babbled incessantly at Li Baoping, trying to convince her to discard that nickname. She knew that once they arrived at Mountain Cliff Academy, if Li Baoping were to call her Little Rock even once, then that nickname would permanently stick and become unshakable. The two little girls trailed along behind Chen Ping'an while continuing to bicker with each other, and as they drew close to Fortune Street, he asked, "There are many residences with the Li surname on Fortune Street. Which one is yours?" Chen Ping'an was thinking to himself that everything would be fine as long as it wasn't the Li manor of the 4 major clans. At the time, in order to lure Bai Yuan onto the mountain, he had climbed up the descendant locust tree onto the wall of the Li manor, and used his slingshot to smash the 2 food containers in that bird cage. Shi Chuanjia wore a disgruntled expression as she grumbled, "Her residence is the one with the locust tree outside." Whenever her parents refused to let her go out for fear that she would cause trouble, she would sneak her way up the wall on a ladder, then climb down the locust tree onto Fortune Street. Last time, her parents were truly furious, and they carried the ladder away, insisting that she enter through the main gate. However, she refused to do what they wanted and jumped directly off the wall. She didn't come to school for an entire month after that, and the 2 months after, she was constantly walking around on crutches. Li Baoping didn't think this was an embarrassing story at all, and she said in a serious manner, "I thought long and hard about what happened, and I realized that my landing position was incorrect. I shouldn't have just jumped straight down and had my legs bear the full impact. I went to try again after my legs were all healed up and you ended up having to skip school for another half a month." Shi Chuanjia exclaimed in exasperation. "I was fine the 3rd time, wasn't I?" Li Baoping countered in a justified manner. "That's only because a year later your body grew, and that's why you were able to handle more punishment. It has nothing to do with your landing position." Shi Chuanjia snapped. Chen Ping'an didn't get involved in the quarrel between the 2 little girls. He was hoping that the people from the Li clan wouldn't recognize him. Otherwise, he would have been in some severe trouble. On top of that, deep down he was very envious of the two little girls, envious of their happy and stable lives, that they had parents to keep them in check, and a school where they could go to receive an education. Despite his reservations, Chen Ping'an still decided to help Li Baoping carry the locust branches to her residence. He had just told Li Baoping that one had to follow through on their promises, so he had no choice but to muster up his courage and go to the Li Manor with her. Perhaps the gods had finally woken up from their nap, or perhaps they felt like Chen Ping'an had suffered enough of late. In any case, the porter of the Li Manor didn't recognize him, and Li Baoping didn't ask him to carry the locust branches into the residence either. Chen Ping'an was very relieved by this turn of events, and he was just about to turn and leave when Li Baoping offered him the branch that she had been carrying on her shoulder, telling him that it was her repayment for his help. Chen Ping'an didn't refuse the branch, casually setting it on his shoulder as he waved her goodbye. The porter was already accustomed to Li Baoping's strange personality, so he wasn't surprised to see her bring back a bunch of locust branches that weren't really good for anything, not even to be used as firewood. Instead, he was feeling a little saddened by the sight of the scratches on her large red jacket from the branches. That jacket was far more valuable than those useless branches. Even before she had turned 5 years of age, Li Baoping had managed to catch a large crab from the creek all by herself. Upon returning home, tears were streaming out of her eyes as she raised her hand up high, and there was a crab clinging onto her little hand with its pincer with all its might, causing much distress for her parents and grandparents. The crab had a dark green shell, but its pincers were bright red, and even to this day, it was still being kept by her in a large vat. She hated reading books, so whenever she had some free time, she would go and chat with the crab. Shi Chuanjia was watching as Chen Ping'an departed when she suddenly turned to Li Baoping as she jibed. "He was the one that made you fall and lose a front tooth, wasn't he?" All of a sudden, Li Baoping made her way behind Shi Chuanjia, then grabbed onto her braids before preparing to lift her upward. "Trust me, it'll definitely work this time." Shi Chuanjia was horrified, and she hurriedly squatted down and closed her eyes as she frantically flailed her arms above her head, trying to sway Li Baoping's hands away. Li Baoping was quite a bit taller than Shi Chuanjia, and she squatted down beside her as she declared in a confident voice, "It won't hurt at all, little rock. How will you know if you don't try it a second time?" Shi Chuanjia immediately burst into tears. The porter couldn't stand to watch any longer, and he stepped in to save Shi Chuanjia. Mr. Ma from the school asked Li Huai to pass a message to us earlier, instructing us to prepare a horse-drawn carriage. "Young mistress, you should pack up your things and go to the school, so you can go on the excursion to Mountain Cliff Academy with the other kids. Of course, on the way to the school, you can make a trip to Dragon Riding Alley and have young Mistress Shi's belongings loaded onto the horse-drawn carriage as well." Thus, Li Baoping had no choice but to let Shi Chuanjia off the hook for now. She was very disappointed, and even as she made her way into the manor, she was still feeling quite forlorn on Shi Chuanjia's behalf. After surviving that close call, Shi Chuanjia decided there and then that she was going to remove her braids. All of a sudden, a surprised look appeared on Li Baoping's face as she looked up at the sky. Shi Chuanjia looked up in the same direction and mused, "It's not going to rain, is it?" A large black cloud was drifting over the sky above the town from north to south. Chen Ping'an had just emerged from Fortune Street, and he was also looking up at the cloud with an utterly astonished expression. That was no cloud, it was an arsenal of flying swords, riding atop which were countless immortals. Chen Ping'an swept his gaze along the direction that the cloud of flying swords was traveling in, and he spotted a black dot traveling from south to north, going in the opposite direction to these immortals. The black dot was growing larger and larger, and all of a sudden Chen Ping'an's eyes widened in shock as if he had just seen a ghost in broad daylight. There was a figure descending from the sky in the south atop a flying sword, pausing momentarily when they were still over 1,000 feet away from the ground in the town. The sword-riding figure looked down at the town, sweeping their gaze in all directions before swooping down toward Fortune Street. The flying sword hurtled through the air, sweeping up a gust of howling wind before arriving in front of Chen Ping'an in the blink of an eye. The sword was hovering around 5 feet above the ground, and atop the sword stood a gallant young woman in a dark green robe. The slightly disheveled young woman had her arms crossed, and she grinned at Chen Ping'an as she declared, "I felt like it was only right for me to bid you farewell, so I came." Before Chen Ping'an had a chance to say anything, The flying sword swiveled around at the young woman's behest, carrying her away into the distant sky. Chen Ping'an reflexively reached out a hand, but at this point, the flying sword and the young woman were already nowhere to be seen. Chen Ping'an sheepishly withdrew his hand, then scratched his head in an awkward manner before continuing on his way back to Clay Vase Alley, occasionally looking up at the sky along the way. Initially, he was feeling a little dejected, but he was quickly buoyed by the realization that Ning Yao was an immortal cultivator as well. He was so elated by this realization that for the first time ever, he bought a Donghua from a shop on Dragon Riding Alley to eat on the way home. For some reason, an empty feeling welled up in his heart as he ate the Donghua, and he didn't know what the source of this feeling was. Perhaps he was feeling bad over the copper coins that he had spent on the Donghua. Chen Ping'an was eating a Donghua for the first time in close to 10 years as he made his way back to Clay Vase Alley with the locust branch on his shoulder, and a sense of guilt welled up in his heart as he passed by a house that was even dilapidated than his own. He was considering borrowing some silver from Master Ruan to have the house repaired. Even though he had been living on Clay Vase Alley his entire life, he had never seen anyone live in this house. During his plot to lure Bai Yuan into the mountains, he had intentionally led the mountain-moving ape to this house, causing him to smash a massive hole into the roof of the house. Chen Ping'an felt a sense of responsibility to have the hole repaired. In its original state, the house would have perhaps been able to last 2 or 3 more decades, but now that it was more exposed to the elements due to the gaping hole on its roof, it most likely wasn't even going to be able to last 5 years. Essentially, it was the same concept as Kai Jinjian forcibly pointing the way for Chen Ping'an, leaving his body open and exposed, much like this house was. Hence, Chen Ping'an was determined to have the house repaired no matter what. It didn't have to be a very grand or spectacular repair job, but it had to be sturdy and serviceable. He had considered swapping a gold essence copper coin for silver or actual copper coins. Perhaps he could go to Old Man Yang or Master Ruan to have one of his gold essence copper coins exchanged, but he had a feeling that these things were exceedingly rare, and with each one that was used up, it would be permanently gone. In contrast, silver and copper coins could be earned anywhere, and it was just a matter of how hard he was willing to work. Hence, Chen Ping'an decided that he was going to see if he could borrow from Master Ruan first, and he would only resort to spending gold essence copper coins if that didn't work. He was extremely reluctant to part with any of his gold essence copper coins, but the problem was constantly staring him right in the eye, and he couldn't just pretend not to see it. He was very averse to owing anyone anything. After returning to his courtyard, Chen Ping'an rested the locust branch that Li Baoping had given to him against the wall. The priceless chunk of dragon-slaying platform was still sitting in the basket, but of course he wasn't just going to leave it in the yard out in the open. Instead, he had already carried the basket into the house. If it weren't for the fact that he was pressed for time, he would have dug a 10 feet tall hole in his yard and buried the chunk of dragon-slaying platform in it. Just the name of the material alone had Chen Ping'an convinced that it had to be even more precious than those 3 pouches of gold essence copper coins. Chen Ping'an could hear the sound of chickens clucking in the neighboring yard. Back when Song Jisun and Jigui left the town, they had left their hen and its chicks behind. At this point, they had to be starving. With that in mind, Chen Ping'an made his way into his house to grab that string of keys, then picked up a handful of rice before making his way into the neighboring yard and opening the chicken cage. He allowed the rice to fall through his fingers for the chickens to feed on, and after that, he opened the door of the kitchen to see if any food had been left behind in case they became rotten or moldy from neglect. As soon as he made his way into the kitchen, he was greeted by an astonishing sight. There was a huge vat full of rice inside, and just the mere sight of it was enough to fill his stomach. The pantry was filled with pots, pans, and all types of cooking utensils, and there was a row of ham and dried fish hanging on the wall. Everything was clean and orderly, and it seemed that Chen Ping'an's concerns had been entirely unwarranted. All of a sudden, his attention was drawn to a pile of firewood near the kitchen counter. He made his way over to the pile of firewood to take a closer look, and sure enough, it was the wooden figure that Jigui had been hacking at with a meat cleaver last time. She didn't know how to chop firewood, so even though she had labored away extensively at the wooden figure, she had made next to no progress. In contrast, Chen Ping'an was able to make short work of the wooden figure, quickly chopping it up into pieces. At this moment, He was squatting down as he examined the pieces of the wooden figure, and he noticed something quite strange. There were red spots engraved onto the wooden figure's entire body, seemingly in a completely random and haphazard fashion. In some places, the red spots were bunched together in dense clumps, while in other places, they were far more spaced apart. Chen Ping'an picked up a section of the wooden figure's arm to take a closer look, and he discovered that extremely tiny black characters were engraved beside each red spot. The red spots were each only around the size of a grain of rice to begin with, and the characters were even smaller, to the point that they were barely visible. Thankfully, Chen Ping'an's exceptional eyesight allowed him to discern the black characters. If a normal person had been in his place, they would have been able to see a bunch of red spots and even tinier black dots. Chen Ping'an attempted to reassemble the pieces of the wooden figure, and it didn't take long before it was restored. Thankfully, it wasn't missing any large sections of its body, but what was rather unfortunate was that many of the red spots and black characters on the connective parts of its body had been hacked away or ground down by Zhigui's cleaver. At a rough visual estimate, Chen Ping'an speculated that only around 70% to 80% of the red spots and black characters were left. Chen Ping'an rose to his feet to open the window to allow more light into the kitchen, then squatted down again to continue examining the pieces of the wooden figure, not daring to miss even the most trivial of details. He did this for around 2 hours, and even though he didn't recognize the majority of the black characters, he still did his best to memorize their structure and strokes. Deep down, he had always wanted to learn to read and write. Back when he was a worker at the kiln, he had looked back at the town on many occasions after scaling to the top of a mountain. The first place that he would search for from his vantage point was Clay Vase Alley, and the second place was often the school. Back in his younger days, he would often go to the school and squat down at the foot of the wall to hear the lessons being taught inside. He didn't understand what was being taught, but just listening to the lessons alone instilled him with a sense of peace and tranquility, and all of the negative emotions that had accumulated during the day would fade away. However, for an orphan who had grown up on Clay Vase Alley like him, receiving an education was an even more distant dream than a Donghua, so the only thing that he could do was watch from afar. At this moment, Chen Ping'an closed his eyes and reconstructed the complete wooden figure in his mind using his memory alone. Whenever he reached an indistinct part in his memory, he didn't rush to open his eyes and examine that part of the wooden figure. Instead, he simply skipped over those parts, and in the end there were around 40 to 50 parts where his memory was rather fuzzy. After examining all of those parts on the wooden figure's body, Chen Ping'an took his deep breath and prepared to repeat the process, but as soon as he closed his eyes, he was struck by a rush of dizziness, and he knew that it wouldn't be wise to force himself any further. There were some things that couldn't be achieved just by pushing oneself harder. In fact, beyond a certain point, it was often the case that the more effort that was given, the less desirable the outcome. This was a valuable lesson that Chen Ping'an had learned during his pottery firing days, not because he possessed exceptional talent, but solely from being constantly insulted and abused by old man Yao instead. Chen Ping'an scattered the wooden figure again and piled all of the parts in a corner of the kitchen before departing from Song Jisen's courtyard. After closing the yard gate, Chen Ping'an paused for a moment to consider what he was going to do next, then decided to pay a visit to Zhang Dafeng again. Once he officially became an apprentice at the blacksmith shop, he was most likely going to live there, so it wasn't going to be possible for him to come back and deliver letters. Hence, Chen Ping'an wanted to give Zhang Dafeng some advance notice, but he had already gone to search for him on a previous occasion and failed to find him. Upon arriving at the eastern town gate on the jog, Chen Ping'an discovered that the door of the earthen hut was still locked, and he heaved a faint sigh upon seeing this. He sat down onto the tree stump that Zhang Dafeng often sat on. Unlike the tree stumps in the mountains, this tree stump wasn't the seat of a mountain god or anything like that. In a rare moment of peace and relaxation for Chen Ping'an, he sat on the tree stump, staring blankly into the distance. After an indeterminate period of time, the sound of rolling carriage wheels rang out from the road inside the town. Chen Ping'an turned to discover an ox-drawn carriage followed by a pair of horse-drawn carriages. A bunch of kids were seated on the ox-drawn carriage, among which were a pair of familiar faces, namely Li Baoping in her large red jacket, and Shi Chuanjia with her delicate red cheeks. The other 3 children on the carriage were presumably Li Huai, Lin Shui, and Dong Shuijing, the other schoolchildren that Shi Chuanjia had mentioned earlier. The 5 children on the ox-drawn carriage were all chatting spiritedly among themselves, and the coach driver was an unfamiliar middle-aged man, seated behind whom was the school's former janitor. The differences in the quality of attire worn by the 5 children were night and day. Shi Chuanje's family had lived on Dragon Riding Alley for generations, running the old pastry shop, so she certainly hadn't grown up poor. However, at the same time, her family couldn't have been said to be particularly wealthy, so her clothes were comfortable and warm, but not excessively extravagant. However, the child next to her wore a brand new black fur coat made from fox fur, and there was a cold and apathetic look on his face. Li Huai's father, Li Er, was renowned in the town for being a pushover, and Li Huai had an elder sister by the name of Li Lu. However, his parents and his elder sister had all left the town for better prospects, leaving only Li Huai behind to live with his uncle. Now, he was also going to be leaving the town, following Old Man Ma to Mountain Cliff Academy. The final boy to round out the 5 was wearing a thin spring garment and a pair of patchy outer garments, clearly indicating that he came from an impoverished background. The 5 children were sitting on the uncovered ox-drawn carriage, traveling to Mountain Cliff Academy, one of the 72 academies of Confucianism and a place that was worshipped by countless scholars on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Eastern Treasured Vile Continent had countless empires and powerful clans and sects, many of which were willing to go to extreme lengths to try and send some of their most promising young prospects to Mountain Cliff Academy, just so they could study the way of managing a nation under the Academy's wise teachers. The 5 children on the carriage were naturally completely oblivious to this, just as they were oblivious to how much of an honor it had been for them to have been able to study under Mr. Qi. On the contrary, these children disliked Mr. Qi for all of the rules that he had set for them and the fact that he was always so serious and unapproachable. Only very rarely would Mr. Qi smile upon them, and on the occasions when he did, the children had no idea what they had done to make him so pleased. Li Baoping had a pair of sharp eyes, and she quickly spotted Chen Ping'an sitting on the tree stump. She immediately jumped down from the ox-drawn carriage like lightning, stumbling slightly before rushing over to Chen Ping'an like the wind, only to abruptly stop in front of him, seemingly unsure of what to say. In the end, she puffed out her chest with a proud expression and declared, "I'm going somewhere really, really far away." "Li Baoping," Old Man Ma called out in a stern voice from the carriage. Even though he was clearly rather displeased, Old Man Ma still instructed the coach driver to stop the carriage. Li Baoping pursed her lips with displeasure, but still turned around and ran back to the carriage. As she did so, she suddenly heard Chen Ping'an call out to her, and she turned to find him raising his fist and pumping it up and down, gesturing for her to do her best. Li Baoping waved her little fist at him in response as a silent promise that she would indeed do her best. An amused smile appeared on Chen Ping'an's face. He had no doubt that Li Baoping was going to do her best, but only when it came to playing. It most likely wasn't going to be long before she left her footsteps all over the entire Mountain Cliff Academy. Chen Ping'an then noticed Old Man Ma looking at him, and as soon as their eyes met, the old man gave him a nod, in response to which Chen Ping'an reflexively returned the nod with a smile. At the same time, someone sitting in one of the horse-drawn carriages behind the ox-drawn carriage gently lowered the curtain. Chen Ping'an was only able to catch a fleeting glimpse of him, but that was enough for him to identify the man as the scholar who had gone to find Master Ruan at his blacksmith shop. Chen Ping'an watched as the 3 carriages slowly made their way out of the town. If Chen Ping'an could take to the heavens atop a flying sword like Ningyao to see this small world, which had just landed and taken root in the earth, he would have definitely been astonished by the sight that would greet him. There were countless animals of all types of different species roaming the land and flying through the sky, lingering on the border between Jewel's small world and the Great Li Empire. Further away, there were even more animals rushing toward the border as quickly as they could, and they seemed to be absorbing something from this place. They didn't dare to take so much as a single step beyond the invisible border, but they were also extremely reluctant to leave. There was also an old woman standing at the end of the creek within the border. Her upper body was exposed above the surface of the water, and her dark green hair was trailing down all around her like a black lotus flower. The old woman's face had previously resembled the bark of a mottled old tree, but at this moment, she appeared to be a woman no more than 40 years of age. There was also Cloud Drape Mountain, which was slowly rising up at a rate that was discernible even to the naked eye, as if something were propping it up from below. The small world had been broken and had descended upon the earth as a blessed land. For all of the native residents of Zhuhou's small world, all of them would have a chance at reincarnation, regardless of their background and what they had done in this life. After returning to the blacksmith shop and completing his manual labor duties, Qian Pingyan carried his bowl and approached Ruan Xiu and Master Ruan during mealtime. He told Master Ruan that he wanted to borrow some money, 15 or 16 taels of silver, to be precise. Ruan Xiong didn't even bother to ask Qian Pingyan the reason why he wanted to borrow money. Instead, he merely took a glance at Qian Pingyan out of the corner of his eyes, then said, "Piss off." Qian Pingyan hurriedly rushed away in a sheepish manner. "Father, can't you be nicer to him?" Ruan Xiu protested with furrowed brows. "I'm already being very nice to him by not beating his ass to a pulp." Ruan Xiong harumphed coldly. Ruan Xiu couldn't help but want to stand up for Qian Pingyan. "He's working so diligently as your apprentice for not a single copper coin of pay. At night, when everyone else is either sleeping or chatting in their rooms, he's the only one who's still carrying soil out of the well one trip after another. He works harder than anyone else here. Can you not see what he's been doing? Have you no conscience? Is it really too much for him to ask to borrow a few taels of silver from you for all the hard work he's done?" Ruan Xiong remained silent with a dark expression, thinking to himself, "It's exactly because I know what he's been doing that I want to chop that little bastard up into 1,000 pieces. If he had the cultivation base of that mountain-moving ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain, I would have done the same thing as Qi Jingchun and given him a vicious beating." The thought of what Qi Jingchun had done to Bai Yuan immediately left him feeling a little dejected. Even if he weren't the sage overseeing this small world, he would have still definitely been able to defeat Bai Yuan, but it would have been impossible for him to defeat such a formidable foe with just a single stomp, as Qi Jingchun had done. Ruan Xiong could only engage in self-consolation by telling himself that even though he was supposed to be a military and swordsman, his true pursuit wasn't to become as formidable in battle as possible. Instead, it was to become the best swordsmith in the world, and forge a living sword that possessed sentience and intelligence. Essentially, his ultimate goal was to create a true living being that could cultivate, die, enter the cycle of reincarnation, and even pursue the great Tao. Ruan Xiong set down his bowl and chopsticks as he raised his head to look up at the sky, then suddenly erupted into a furious tirade out of nowhere. "Do you bastards think you can do whatever you want now that Qi Jingchun's dead? I've already told you the rules. If you're going to blatantly break those rules, then I presume that you're prepared to bear the consequences." There was no one around him, but all of a sudden, he erupted into the sky as a streak of white light, hurtling toward the clouds up above. Above the clouds was a group of well-dressed men and women soaring through the sky while chatting amicably with one another. They were like true deities taking a stroll above the clouds, occasionally looking down at Zhuhou's small world as if they were on a sightseeing tour. All of a sudden, a resounding boom rang out, and the head of a regal woman wearing a golden hairpin abruptly exploded. Immediately thereafter, the head of the beautiful young woman beside her also exploded, as did the heads of everyone else in the group, one after another. Ruan Xiong was hovering in the air above the resplendent sea of clouds, looking around with a cold gleam in his eyes as he chuckled. "Are you really just going to send out small fry like this to test my patience? How little do you think of me? While it's true that I'm just a blacksmith, and I can't even begin to compare with Qi Jingchun, slaying a few insolent 10th-tier cultivators here is nothing for me. From now on, there's a new rule for all of you to follow, so you better listen up. Even if you hide outside the border and try to look into Zhuhou Blessed Land, I'll drag you into the Blessed Land just the same and smash your heads open if you catch me in a bad mood. If you don't believe me, you're free to try your luck." After making this declaration, Ruan Xiong flew through the air in a flash, and in the next instant, his hand closed around the head of an old man, whom he dragged into the border. The old man hurriedly began pleading for his life. Master Ruan, please let's be civilized about this. I'm from the nearby Purple Smoke River." Before the old man had a chance to finish what he was saying, Ruan Xiong crushed his head before casually tossing his headless body out of the border. A streak of green light immediately sprang out of the headless body before fleeing into the distance, and Ruan Xiong merely took a cold glance at it, but refrained from going any further. The streak of green light was over 3 feet in length, and it sped through the air as quickly as it could, flying close to 1,000 kilometers before plunging into a large river with faint purple smoke swirling in the air above it. The river was extremely massive and spectacular to behold, much more so than any of the bodies of water in the Great Li Empire. Ruanqiong's fingers were still tinged with the blood of the old man as he loudly declared, "This is how things will be for the next 60 years. Far away in the distance, a female cultivator concealed herself in the sea of clouds as she grumbled in a furious voice, "How could you be so barbaric? This is not how a sage overseeing a blessed land should be conducting himself." Ruanqiong couldn't help but burst into laughter. "Aren't you quite the smart girl, only bad-mouthing me after you've gotten far away? You think I can't do anything to you over there, right? You little bitch, I'm not an idiot scholar like Qi Jingchun. You want to talk to a militarian swordsman like me about proper conduct? Were you dropped on your head as a baby?" Ruanqiong pointed an arm diagonally downward, joining his index and middle fingers together as he silently called, "Astral winds and infernal lightning, heed my call." All of a sudden, two auras began to churn rapidly between heaven and earth, like a pair of springs that had just emerged out of nowhere. On the other side, a panicked voice hurriedly rang out, "These are Ruanqiong's bonded wind and lightning swords. Run Leitang." Ruanqiong's bonded artifacts are different from those of the average person in that they're not nurtured in his acupoint. Instead, they exist around him, following his pair of militarian deities. Above the sea of clouds, a speck of green flames desperately fled into the distance. Outside of the speck of green fire were a series of glittering and translucent peach blossoms, revolving around the flame to protect it from the outside. The speck of green fire flew close to 400 kilometers before being struck down by an azure thread through the head. As for the man who had spoken up earlier to warn her about Ruanqiong's powers, he had already fled at the first sign of danger, and no one dared to say anything else after what had just happened. Ruanqiong gave a cold harumph, then descended onto the bank of creek near the blacksmith shop before washing the blood from his hands using the water in the creek. He heaved a faint sigh as he murmured to himself, "Qi Jingchun, if you had been even half as unreasonable as I am, there's no way you would have suffered such a sad demise." Meanwhile, Chun Ping'an was on the way back from his 2-hour-long session of walking meditation. He had just completed the session and was in the process of performing some stretches when he suddenly spotted Master Ruan making his way up to the bank from the creek. After a brief hesitation, he slowed down slightly, keeping his distance from Master Ruan. He didn't know why, but he could sense that Master Ruan wasn't very fond of him, and the way that Master Ruan looked at him reminded him of the way that old man Yao used to look at him. Ruanqiong paid no heed to Chun Ping'an as he made his way back to the blacksmith shop. Chun Ping'an turned to look at the creek, and nothing appeared to be amiss. However, for some reason, a chill had run down his spine just now, as if there were water-dwelling ghosts looking out at him from the creek. It was a very strange and unsettling feeling, but all he could see was the water in the creek flowing along gently as normal. Chun Ping'an wasn't convinced, and he picked up several rocks of just the right weight, then turned and waded into the creek in the downstream direction before carefully examining the flowing water, trying to find the source of the unsettling feeling he had just been struck by. The more he looked at the water, the more he felt like something was wrong. Under the broad daylight, the water of the creek was somehow giving off a sense of sinister eeriness. Chun Ping'an had ventured into the deep pit at the foot of the Azure Cow Ridge on many past occasions, but even in there, he had never felt so unsettled and disturbed. At this point, Chun Ping'an was already certain that there were unfathomable things, such as monsters, spirits, and ghosts that existed in this world. In the past, with Mr. Qi at the town, no evil entities had dared to rear their ugly heads here, but now that Mr. Qi wasn't here anymore, there was no guarantee that this place would still remain safe and untouched, so he had to be very careful. Even when it came to Master Ruan, the so-called next sage, taking over from Mr. Qi, Chun Ping'an didn't dare to lower his guard. Ultimately, he only trusted Mr. Qi. He felt a sense of fear and respect toward the stern Master Ruan, but nothing beyond that. Chun Ping'an only dared to trust in his instincts and venture into the creek to investigate as Master Ruan had only just left the creek. He was fairly confident that even if there were some sinister entities in the water, there was no way that they would dare to kill him right under the nose of a sage. Furthermore, he was carrying the pair of mountain and water seals that Mr. Qi had given him up his sleeve, and one of them was a water seal, so that only served to instill him with more courage. After tossing 2 handfuls of rocks into the water, Chen Ping'an was just about to pick up some more when someone from nearby asked, "What are you doing?" It was Ruan Xiao. Chen Ping'an's attention had been focused entirely on the water this entire time, so he didn't sense her presence. He made no effort to hide what he was doing as he pointed at the surface of the water and answered truthfully, "I feel like there's something dirty in the water, and I'm trying to see if I can force it to come out by pelting it with rocks." Ruan cast her gaze toward the water in the creek, and a grim look instantly appeared on her face. "Is there really something dirty in here?" Chen Ping'an asked. "I can't see anything," Ruan Xiao replied with a shake of her head. "I'm probably just being too paranoid then," Chen Ping'an said with a smile. Ruan Xiao lowered her voice as she said, "Go back to the blacksmith shop. I'm going to eat something here before I go back. If my father asks about it, just say you didn't see anything." Chen Ping'an nodded in response. "No problem." All of a sudden, a thought occurred to him, and he picked up a sharp rock from the ground, then asked, "Ruan Xiao, can I ask you about the meanings and pronunciations of some characters?" Ruan Xiao immediately tensed up at the prospect of having to read. In her mind, books were the most terrifying enemies under the heavens. Whenever she flipped open a book to any page, she would always feel like the characters on the page were a formidable army that was challenging her to a battle, making her head spin and throb. She was actually supposed to go and study in the school after arriving in the town with her father, and there was no need for her to help him in his forge. However, she refused to go no matter what. One day, she would claim that she had a stomach ache. The next day, she would say that she had a fever, and she would roll her ankle the day after that. The only reason why Ruan Xiong was choosing to let her off the hook now was because he had grown tired of her clearly fabricated excuses. However, Ruan Xiao didn't want to embarrass herself in front of Chen Ping'an, so she forced herself to remain calm and put on a confident smile as she said, "Go ahead." Chen Ping'an carved out a couple of characters onto the ground with the sharp rock, and as soon as Ruan Xiao saw the 2 characters, her feigned confidence immediately turned to genuine confidence as she said in an elated manner, "These 2 characters are way too simple. I already knew them from a very young age. One of them is divine, while the other is court. And when put together, they spell out the name of an acupoint on the human body. The reason why us humans are known as the rulers of all sentient beings is because our bodies are most suitable for cultivation. It's also because of this that many monsters and demons that attain the Great Tao have no choice but to manifest human forms at some point in their cultivation journey. The 365 acupoints in the human body are all like mountains of treasures. There's an ancient saying that acupoints are the avenues through which divine energy enter and exit the body, and our soul is like a child who is able to grow up thanks to the kindness and charity of others, being spared a bowl of rice by one family, then a bowl of water by another, slowly developing and becoming stronger. Ruan Xiao extended a finger and pointed it at her own head as she continued with a smile. "This is where the divine court acupoint is located, 5 centimeters up from your hairline. This acupoint isn't all that important for militarian swordsmen like me and my father. Essentially, it's an expendable acupoint for us, but for those beings on the other side, this acupoint is of the utmost importance. However, my father tells me that those ghostly beings are severely limited in their potential. No matter how powerful they become, they're nothing more than pitiful beings that are solely reliant on others." Chen Ping'an had no idea what he had just been told, so he could only memorize what Ruan Xiao had just said in the hope that he would be able to understand the meaning of these words in the future. After that, he asked about the Giant Tower and the Great Void acupoints, and Ruan Xiao was able to provide an explanation in both cases. She was very averse to reading, but that was only limited to the classics lauded by scholars. In contrast, she was extremely eager to read materials related to military cultivation and swordsmanship, so from a young age, she had memorized all of the acupoints and their locations on the body. Before Chen Ping'an had a chance to ask, Ruan Xiao smiled as she declared, "When I get the time to do so in the future, I'll tell you the names, locations, and purposes of all of the 365 acupoints on the human body." "I'll have to trouble you then, Ruan Xiao," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. "Do you feel like I'm troubling you by asking you to buy pastries for me?" Ruan Xiao asked. "Not at all," Chen Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. "There you go. This is no trouble for me either. Ruanxiu said with a happy smile. However, a slightly forlorn look then appeared on her face as she continued. Even if you learn about all of the acupoints, that knowledge isn't going to do you much good. There are so many paths that one can take in cultivation, and the reason for this is that there are countless different ways of qi refinement. Even the slightest difference in one's cultivation method could result in massive disparities. Our family has a pair of cultivation methods, one for qi dispersion and one for qi development, both of which have been passed down for generations, but they're family secrets that can't be passed on to outsiders. This is not a matter of whether my father approves or not. I'm sorry, Chun Ping'an. Chun Ping'an wasn't the type of person to ask for more than he was given, and he hurriedly smiled as he explained, "It's fine. I just wanted to learn more characters. I haven't even thought about cultivation. Besides, I already have a fist technique that I can practice. Just that alone is already too much for me to handle. I can't afford to divert my attention elsewhere." Ruanxiu was quite relieved to hear this, and she patted her own chest as she said, "That's good to hear." As she did so, a certain pair of monuments quivered under her clothes, presenting an alluring sight to behold. Chun Ping'an hurriedly raised his gaze, putting on a serious expression as she said, "I'll wait until you have some spare time. I can go back to Clay Vase Alley a bit later anyway." "Sure," Ruanxiu replied with a smile and a nod. With that, Chun Ping'an jogged over to the blacksmith shop. Ruanxiu made her way down the slope to the bank of the creek, then pulled out a handkerchief, out of which she produced a piece of pastry that she placed into her own mouth. Only after Chun Ping'an had arrived at the blacksmith shop did she roll up a section of her sleeve to reveal that bright red bracelet. She cast her gaze toward the clear creek water, then said, "The fire dragon roams the water." The bracelet instantly melted, and a living being emerged, struggling and writhing incessantly before finally transforming into a miniature flood dragon that was entirely formed by flames. Its head and tail were connected, and its body was just the right length to encircle her wrist. Following an order from her, the crimson flood dragon, which was no more than a foot in length, sprang toward the creek. As it did so, it rapidly extended to 100 feet in length, upon which Ruanxiu ordered, "That's enough." The fiery dragon's body didn't elongate any further, but all of the nearby water in the creek had completely evaporated. Not only that, but the water upstream was like an army that had suffered a crushing defeat, not daring to advance any further. More and more water flowed to one place, and the water level was constantly rising, while the water downstream continued onward, creating a rift in the creek. Ruanxiu's eyes narrowed slightly as she peered out at the creek, waiting for something to emerge. She strode along the bed of the dry creek, trailing along behind the fiery dragon. Now that the small world had fallen, the restrictions that the four sages had meticulously set up had also vanished, so mystical abilities were no longer prohibited. This was also why Ruanxiu had established a new set of rules, and why he had enforced those rules in such a violent and assertive manner to set an example. This was the smallest of the 36 small worlds, and it was also the one that was most lacking in natural treasures, but ultimately it was still a blessed land that was once a small world, so it was still able to provide many benefits that could significantly enhance one's cultivation. Now that the formation was no longer active, cultivators from the outside would flood into the town if no new rules were established. Those cultivators had no regard for the town's residents, so if Ruanxiu were to allow them to do as they pleased, then all of the town's residents would most likely be killed off in a single day, with the exception of powerful old hermits residing in the town. Even among militarians, it was very important to set rules, but they were far more flexible than Confucianists, able and willing to adapt according to the situation. Around 15 minutes later, the fiery dragon that had been constantly prowling the creek bed seemed to have finally caught its elusive target, and it swooped down ferociously before slowly lowering its head. Ruanxiu made her way over to the head of the fiery dragon, then looked down to find a woman curled up into a ball on the creek bed. She had been caught under the claws of the fiery dragon, and she had a head of waist-length hair that she was using to desperately protect her entire body. An intrigued look appeared in Ruanxiu's eyes as she mused, "To think that even a mere river guardian like yourself would dare to show up right on our doorstep. Have you not heard about how my father once slew 6 great river gods in a row?" Caught within the clutches of the fiery dragon, the river guardian desperately implored, "Please spare me, esteemed immortal. I'm just passing through this place, I have no intentions of offending anyone. I only dared to release my ungodly aura in the hope of helping Sage Ruan, where I can by increasing the density of the water in the creek. Please don't be offended, esteemed immortal. If you find my form too unsightly to behold, then I'll make sure to only come out at night from now on. You know Chen Ping'an? Ruan Xiu asked. The river guardian was rapidly aging under the claws of the fiery dragon, but she only dared to whimper in a pitiful voice as she quickly nodded in response. I do. I used to live on Apricot Blossom Alley, while Chen Ping'an is an orphan from Clay Vase Alley, so we met occasionally in the past, but there's no bad blood at all between us. It's just that I very rarely see any of the townsfolk near the creek, so I was rather curious when I spotted him practicing his fist technique today, and I decided to take a closer look. Never did I think that I would offend you through my actions, esteemed immortal. Please excuse my ignorance and spare me. With a casual wave of her hand, the fiery dragon reverted back into a red bracelet that fitted itself around her wrist. As a result, the water upstream began to flow once again, while Ruan Xiu continued to remain on the creek bed. However, in the next instant, the river guardian was horrified to see that the water was avoiding Ruan Xiu at all costs as if she were the bane of its existence, skirting around her in a wide berth before flowing downstream. What was even more terrifying was that the river guardian could sense that Ruan Xiu wasn't using any mystical abilities. Ruan Xiu smiled as she said, "Don't just stand there with your mouth hanging open. Tell me everything you know about Apricot Blossom Alley and Clay Vase Alley." Having been freed from the fiery dragon's clutches, the river guardian was beginning to slowly rejuvenate into a more youthful form once again. But in the next instant, she suddenly let loose a shriek of alarm and horror. As it turned out, her head of dark green hair was shortening in length, and she screeched in a frantic voice, "Why is my Dao foundation seeping away?" Ruan Xiu was chewing on a piece of pastry as she said in a muffled voice, "Oh, sorry about that. I forgot to tell you that I possess an innate fire god constitution, so water is my natural enemy." The river guardian forced herself to calm down, then began silently weeping as she implored, "Please spare me out of the infinite kindness of your heart, esteemed immortal. I mean, no offense." After a moment of consideration, Ruan Xiu decided, "I'm going to call you to tell me stories from now on. Don't worry, I'll be sure to conceal my aura while you're in my presence." The river guardian didn't dare to refuse, so she could only accept this arrangement with a sullen expression. Ruan Xiu made her up the bank of the creek, then turned around as she said, "Don't let this happen again." The river guardian hurriedly nodded in response. Ruan Xiu strode toward the blacksmith shop with her ponytail swaying from side to side, while the river guardian dove back into the water with her face twisted in resentment and fury. However, having already been taught several painful lessons, she had begun to learn to suppress her resentment at all costs. Right at this moment, a voice rang out directly within her heart. "Suspend your ignorance, you fool. Do you know what a woman's Dao attainment catalyst is? It's to kill all of the river gods on an entire continent. How dare a mere river guardian like you harbor resentment towards someone like her? Know your place. Even if she does nothing but stand there and allow you to attack her, you'll be the only one that ends up dead. Do you know how sensitive she is to all entities residing in water? I know what you're thinking right now, and you're correct. The first river god that she's going to kill in the future will be none other than you, so you'd better think of a way to salvage this situation. If you can do that, this could turn from an unmitigated disaster into an unparalleled opportunity for you. This is my final warning to you. If you dare to take any further steps out of line, then you won't have to wait for retribution from others. I'll be the first one to make sure that you'll wish you were dead." Even after the voice faded, the river guardian continued to float in the water in a dazed manner, and all of the life seemed to have been sucked out of her body. The great Tao seemed so ethereal and out of reach, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. Ruan Xiu watched with a displeased expression as his daughter skipped into the swordsmithing room, and he grumbled, "Are you pleased with yourself for picking on a mere river guardian?" Ruan Xiu wore a dazzling smile as she replied, "All right, then I'll wait until she becomes a river god before I pick on her again." Ruan Xiu's brows furrowed slightly as he cautioned, "Xiu, don't underestimate river gods. They are true water gods that preside over entire bodies of water, and they may not be able to compare with the 5 mountains of each empire, but it's certainly not an easy task to kill them while they're in the water. In that case, I'll just make sure that there's no water for them to reside in, Ruanxiu replied in a casual manner. Ruanxiu's heart jolted slightly, and he hurriedly suppressed the smile that was playing on his lips. That night, an unfamiliar visitor arrived at the blacksmith shop. The man appeared to be roughly 30 years of age, and he was quite tall and broad, with fair skin and a pair of sleek long brows. His elegant and delicate appearance coupled with his imposing stature presented a rather peculiar contrast to behold. After being informed of the man's arrival, Ruanxiu arranged a welcome that was far more formal than the one he had prepared for Cui Minghuang, where the two had only had a brief chat at the entrance to the swordsmithing room. On this occasion, he instructed Ruanxiu to carry out a pair of bamboo chairs, and he even brought out 2 flagons of fine wine, one for each person. The visitor gladly accepted the flagon of wine, removing the clay seal before taking a swig, then smiled as he said, "You've really made a bold statement with what you did earlier, Master Ruan. I don't know how the Imperial Court is going to react for now, but as the newly assigned kiln supervision official and head official of Dragon Spring County, you've saved me a lot of trouble. I should have been the one to bring some good wine to visit you, but I heard about what happened on the way here, so I was in a hurry to get here, and in my haste I passed by the shop on Dragon Riding Alley. I owe you 2 large urns of apricot blossom wine." Master Ruan waved a dismissive hand as he said, "There's no need for these pleasantries. If our negotiation goes well here, we'll have plenty more opportunities to chat over wine in the future, and if the negotiation goes awry, then you won't have to bother trying to get on my good side." The man burst into laughter, and he appeared much more like a traveling hero than an official of the Great Li Empire's imperial court. He dabbed at his own lips with his sleeve, then set his flagon of wine down onto his knee, and it seemed that he was about to discuss something serious with Ruanxiu. As I'm sure you're already aware, the mountains here were sealed off by the imperial court during the spring crest year. Of course, that's only the official explanation given by the Ministry of Revenue. According to the local chronicles, the actual reason for the mountains being sealed off is because halfway up the mountain known as Dragon's Pine Mountain, a large piece of naturally formed dragon-slaying platform appeared. Prior to coming here, I had a meeting with His Majesty, and I was explicitly told that the dragon-slaying platform is to be shared between the Wind Snow Temple that you belong to and True Martial Mountain. As for exactly what you do with the dragon-slaying platform, whether you choose to excavate it, split it up, keep it in its original place, or take it back to your respective sects, that is entirely up to your 2 sects, and our Great Li Empire will not interfere under any circumstance. In fact, if you require assistance from our Great Li Empire, for example, you need the 2 young mountain-moving apes under the Great Li Empire's control to smash open the mountain and reveal the dragon-slaying platform, then just state your request, and we would be more than happy to oblige. That's a lot of sincerity being displayed by your Great Li Empire, Master Ruan remarked with a smile. The new kiln supervision official also smiled, and he was just about to say something when Master Ruan continued, "Prior to coming here, our Wind Snow Temple and True Martial Mountain had already arrived at an agreement on the dragon-slaying platform, with the Wind Snow Temple, True Martial Mountain, and myself each taking a third. I'm sure you've already heard from your emperor that I'm planning to establish a sect here, and that's why both my daughter and I have already detached ourselves from the Wind Snow Temple. It won't be very appropriate for me to establish my sect anytime in the next 60 years, but as long as your Great Li Empire doesn't do anything to get on my bad side, I'll select a mountain here at the conclusion of the 60-year period as the site for my future sect." The new kiln supervision official made no attempt to hide his elation upon hearing this. In fact, this seemed to have been what he was waiting to hear all along, and he immediately replied, "Rest assured, Master Ruan. Aside from Cloud Drape Mountain, there are 61 mountains in our Great Li Empire, and you can choose any 3 of them to serve as the site for your future sect. If you don't want to make a decision right now, I can show you the new and old mountain topography charts for Jewel Small World, then take you to see the mountains before you make a decision. What do you think? It would be immensely beneficial for any empire to have a mighty cultivator of Ruanxiu's caliber settling within its boundaries. In particular, Ruanxiu clearly had intentions of settling permanently here, rather than just staying in the Great Li Empire on a temporary basis as a guest elder, advisor, or imperial preceptor. Hence, he was going to become an integral part of the empire, rather than just an accessory piece, and even if the emperor of the Great Li Empire were in the kiln supervision official's place, he would have undoubtedly been ecstatic to hear this. The Great Li Empire was filled with powerful martial artists, with Song Chongjing leading the way, and it had by far the most martial artists in the middle 5 tiers out of any empire on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. However, it had a pitiful number of immortal cultivators, far fewer than what a powerful empire like the Great Li Empire should have had, and that had always been an area of concern for the emperor. Ruanqiong smiled as he said, "I'm in no hurry to select any mountains. To be frank, aside from Cloud Drape Mountain, which you're not willing to offer to me, none of the other mountains appeal to me at all." A slightly awkward look appeared on the young kiln supervision official's face. Prior to coming here, both his master and the emperor of the Great Li Empire had speculated that there was a chance that Ruanqiong would establish his sect in the Great Li Empire, but the chances were definitely rather slim. The reason for this was because the Great Li Empire really didn't have enough to offer to Ruanqiong. When it came to the dragon-slaying platform, if it weren't for the fact that Ruanqiong was powerful enough on his own to negotiate with the Wind Snow Temple and True Martial Mountain, there was no way that the Great Li Empire would have dared to cross those two sects just to appease Ruanqiong. The consequences of doing something like that would have been far too severe for the empire to bear. Ruanqiong suddenly said, "Wind Snow Temple and True Martial Mountain have never made this proposal, but I personally hope that your Great Li Empire can provide 2 sufficiently sharp weapons, whether that be swords or sabers. The type of weapon doesn't matter, as long as they can be used to split the dragon-slaying platform. Bring them to me, and I'll help you pass them on to the 2 militarian cultivators who have been sent here. There's no hurry in this matter either, so you can relay my request to the imperial court and await a response from the emperor." The kiln supervision official considered the request for a moment, then declared, "I can make that decision, Master Ruan. Consider it done." Ruanqiong nodded in response, then took a sip of wine, seemingly quite pleased with the kiln supervision official's attitude and decisiveness. He was going to have to deal with this new kiln supervision official by the name of Wu Yuan for a long time to come, so he was very relieved to see that he wasn't dealing with someone foolish or cowardly. After a brief hesitation, Wu Yuan took a sip of wine, seemingly to bolster his own resolve, then said, "Master Ruan, firstly, all of the 30 or so dragon kills outside the town will begin operation again, but from now on, they'll only be producing ordinary chinaware to be used in the imperial court. Secondly, once the new county office is constructed on the eastern side of the town, the laws of the Great Li Empire will be released on a plaque for all to see, and we'll also be sending out people to announce and explain these new laws. This is so that we can make the town's residents aware that they're now citizens of the Great Li Empire." A cold look appeared on Ruanqiong's face as he took a glance at Wu Yuan, and the other smiled and explained, "Of course, these laws only apply to the ordinary residents of the town. Within the next 60 years, your rules will still remain paramount in this town, followed by the rules of the 4 surnames and 10 clans, and only after that comes the laws of the Great Li Empire. If there's any conflict in those rules, the hierarchy that I just mentioned will decide which one takes precedence. Within a radius of 500 kilometers of the town, our Great Li Empire won't interfere with anything that you do, and we'll be giving you our unreserved support." I'm not sure if you recall that cultivator from Purple Smoke River. After you destroyed his physical body, he still didn't learn his lesson and attempted to use his connections in the capital city to complain to the emperor. As soon as my master heard about this, he immediately sent someone to eradicate his soul. Ruanqiong's brows furrowed slightly with vexation. "Tell your master not to go around doing such unnecessary things. There's no need to do things like this behind my back. I'm just a blacksmith, I don't like all this funny business. If your Great Li Empire really wants to show me its sincerity, then give me actual tangible benefits and that's enough. As for whether I accept those benefits, that's up to me. Besides, if I really wanted to kill that piece of trash from Purple Smoke River, do you think he would have been able to get away? If I really want to kill someone, who in your Great Li Empire can stop me? Even if you can find someone capable of stopping me, would they be willing to oppose me?" Wu Yuan's face paled slightly as he said in a slightly strained voice, "I'll be sure to keep that in mind, Master Ruan." Ruanqiong didn't want to make the conversation too hostile. After all, this was only their first meeting, and it would have been asking far too much to expect Wu Yuan to know exactly what he wanted and act accordingly. Hence, he changed the subject to ease the tension in the air. It should be an imperial court's responsibility to construct Wenchang pavilions and martial sage temples, assign official mountain and water gods, and ban all unofficial temples within their territory. How do you plan to carry out these tasks in the town? Having just been scolded by Ruan Qiong, Wu Yuan carefully considered his response this time before giving an answer. With regard to the construction of the Wenchang pavilions and martial sage temples, our greatly empire's officials of astronomy and feng shui masters have two sites in mind, one of which is the mountain of porcelain situated to the north of the town, while the other is the immortal tomb in the southeast. The two people overseeing the ritual will be the pair of individuals who emerged from the town, and it just so happens that one of them is an accomplished scholar, while the other is a decorated martial artist, both of whom have also made significant contributions to our greatly empire. What do you think, Master Ruan? Ruan Qiong replied in a serious voice. I have no objection to the two people you've chosen, but have you already decided on the locations? Have you consulted Old Man Yang for his opinion first? Wu Yuan was instantly stumped by this question, and he asked in a careful voice, Master Ruan, may I ask who Old Man Yang is? Ruan Qiong was also quite taken aback to hear this, and he jibed, Embroidered Tiger didn't even tell you about Old Man Yang before sending you here to become the town's kiln supervision official? Be honest with me, are you in a similar position to the one Qi Jingchun was in? Did you mess up in the imperial court and end up being banished here as a punishment? If that's the case, then I'm going to have to revoke everything we agreed on earlier. Not only was Wu Yuan completely stumped by this situation, he had no idea how to explain himself. Meanwhile, three people of around the same age were seated on the ground next to the well. Ruan Xiu was teaching Chan Ping'an the names of the acupoints in the human body, and their purposes when it came to cultivation, while the other boy had approached them out of the blue. Initially, Ruan Xiu and Chan Ping'an had remained silent as they stared at the boy, who had a set of rather delicate facial features. There was a small red birthmark on his glabella, and he had a very friendly and amicable appearance. However, both Chan Ping'an and Ruan Xiu had underestimated his tenacity and shamelessness. His smile didn't waver in the slightest as he looked back at Chan Ping'an and Ruan Xiu in silence, and after a stalemate that lasted several minutes, the boy seemed to have come to the realization that he had also underestimated the willpower of the two people beside him, and he finally broke the silence, speaking fluently in the town's dialect, informing the two of them that he was from the capital city, and that he had come here with the kiln supervision official to see the scenery. In particular, he really wanted to see the mountain of porcelain. Why don't you continue in your discussion of acupoints? Don't be so stingy, I just want to hear what you were talking about. It's not like I'll suddenly become a terrestrial god from overhearing your conversation. After that, Chan Ping'an and Ruan Xiu continued their discussion, paying no further heed to this unwelcome guest. I must say, your handwriting is not great. It's clear that you haven't spent much time and effort practicing your handwriting. It's very wishy-washy, like oil floating on the surface of water. Also, the explanation you offered here isn't very complete. You only stated the what, but now the how or the why, which are just as integral if not more important. You're just going to skip over this acupoint? Why didn't you point out the Donghua acupoint to him? Is it because it's a little awkward? If you're too embarrassed to demonstrate, I can point it out to him for you. Why are you looking at me like that? You must be misunderstanding my intentions. What I'm saying is that I'll point it out on my own body, not on yours. Even an omnipotent being would struggle to find the Donghua acupoint on your body, so there's no point for me to try. Hey, why did you hit me? Ow, again? I'm sorry. Stop. Why did you skip the 3 integral acupoints on the back as well? As the saying goes, opening up the 3 integral back acupoints is half the work done, so they're clearly very important. In the end, it was Wu Yuan who stepped in to save Chan Ping'an and Ruan Xiu from the intrusive young boy, and the two of them departed from the blacksmith shop together. Chan Ping'an and Ruan Xiu were seated on the edge of the well, and the latter took a glance at the pair of departing figures as she said, The older of the two is an official, but I'm not sure about that boy. I didn't sense anything special about him. Perhaps he's that man's scholarly attendant. There are many affluent scholars in the outside world who go around with scholarly attendants by their side. Chan Ping'an nodded in response. Shortly thereafter, Ruan Qiong made his way over to the well with a stern expression, then ordered, Chen Ping'an, come with me. Chen Ping'an stood up with a puzzled expression. Ruan Xiao had told him that her father was willing to lend him money, but he was going to have to wait around 10 days. Could it be that Ruan Xiong had gone back on his promise? Ruan Xiao was also a little concerned, so she trailed along behind Chen Ping'an. Ruan Xiong sat down onto a bamboo chair, then gestured for Chen Ping'an to take a seat on the chair that had just been occupied by Wu Yuan. Ruan Xiao cleared her throat, then smiled as she said, "Father, these 2 chairs were made by Chen Ping'an. They're pretty comfortable, right? I have something serious to discuss with Chen Ping'an, so don't interrupt us, Xiao Xiao," Ruan Xiong said with a dark expression. "Please go ahead, Master Ruan," Chen Ping'an prompted as he hurriedly sat up straighter. Ruan Xiong pulled what appeared to be roughly 3 or 4 tails out of his sleeve, then instructed, "Go to Dragon Riding Alley and buy me a flagon of premium spring peach blossom wine. You can buy some pastries with the leftover silver." Ruan Xiao was rather reluctant to do as she was told, so Ruan Xiong threatened to stow the silver away again as he said, "In that case, you can go to keep an eye on the fire in the furnace of the swordsmithing room." Ruan Xiao immediately grabbed the silver and rushed away. After Ruan Xiao had disappeared into the distance, Ruan Xiong turned back to Chen Ping'an and asked, "Chen Ping'an, you have 3 pouches of gold essence copper coins, is that right?" "I do," Chen Ping'an immediately replied with a nod. Ruan Xiong seemed to be rather pleased with Chen Ping'an's honesty, and his expression eased slightly as he said, "No other resident of this town would have 3 pouches of gold essence copper coins in their possession. Even the Song clan, which has the most pouches of gold essence copper coins among the 4 surnames and 10 clans on Fortune Street and Peach Leaf Alley, only has 2 pouches. As for the rest, they only have 1 pouch at most. Aside from them, there are 8 smaller households in the town that were able to secure a pouch of gold essence copper coins, each in exchange for the treasures in their possession. At this point, most of the valuable old artifacts in the town have been taken, and there are only around 7 or 8 decent ones left. From now on, there are going to be more and more outsiders coming into the town. Of course, you don't have to worry about your own safety, so I'm going to be open and candid with you. I hope that you can use your 3 pouches of gold essence copper coins wisely and effectively. Don't squander them carelessly, but don't just stubbornly hold on to them either. Before I took over, the town would open its doors to the outside world once every 60 years, and around 20 to 30 outsiders would be allowed into the town to search for fated opportunities each time. From now on, that practice no longer exists, and this place will become just like any ordinary town in the Great Li Empire. Hence, your 3 pouches of gold essence copper coins will be particularly attention-grabbing, and ultimately, they'll only attract trouble for you. I'm a man who tries to avoid trouble wherever possible, but if you get into trouble, I'll have no choice but to stand up for you. I don't want to have to act as a bodyguard for a brat like you all the time, so I have a piece of advice for you, but it's up to you whether you follow my advice or not. Before I tell you my suggestion, let me make one thing clear to you. This is the time when gold essence copper coins are at their most valuable, but not just anyone will be able to spend them. The Emperor of the Great Li Empire is planning to lift the restrictions on all of the 61 mountains aside from Cloud Drape Mountain to be sold to the powers and sects allied with the Great Li Empire. The prices of the mountains will vary depending on their sizes, and many people on the outside are salivating at this prospect. Even though Jewel Small World's formation has been broken, and it's been reduced to a blessed land, thereby resulting in a sharp decrease in the spiritual energy here, the mountains in this place are still far superior to those on the outside. In fact, they're not inferior in the slightest, even compared with mountain ranges that are overseen by official mountain gods. On top of that, the Emperor of the Great Li Empire has declared that he will be assigning a great mountain god, 3 mountain gods, and a river god in this place. With so many mountain and river gods in such a small place, this blessed land will be sure to continue to thrive even 60 years from now. The spiritual energy here will remain abundant, so this is the best time to be buying some mountains, and it'll definitely prove to be a profitable investment. What if I buy a mountain today but end up dead tomorrow? Chen Ping'an asked. This was a very realistic concern, and a rare smile appeared on Ruan Xiong's face as he replied, "Firstly, as long as you continue to do the right things and don't step out of line in this town, I guarantee you that you won't just inexplicably end up dead someday." Qi Jingchun had to be careful with everything that he did because he was afraid that Jewel Small World would be shattered if he went too far. But such qualms are no longer necessary. If some trash like that mountain-moving ape dares to come after you now, I'll make sure he doesn't leave this place alive. Going back to the sale of the mountains, the Great Li Empire's imperial court is selling these mountains for cheap in order to establish good karma with certain powers outside of the empire. Essentially, it's like a merchant selling their wares at below cost price. On top of that, they've made a promise that even if a buyer of a mountain dies and has no descendants to inherit the mountain, the Great Li Empire will still leave the mountain untouched for a period of 300 years from the date of purchase. The last thing I have to tell you is that I will be claiming 3 mountains with the best feng shui, and I advise you to purchase mountains neighboring mine. You may not have the ability to tap into the mountains for profit, but at the very least you can rent your mountains for 500 years, and you'll receive dividends every year. It'll be passive income that you can enjoy while you're here, and even after you're gone, your descendants will still reap the rewards. This type of passive income was something that countless powerful clans and sects dreamed of, but Ruan Qiong refrained from telling Chen Ping'an this as it was unbefitting of a sage like him to boast to a child. Can you tell me about the prices of the mountains, Master Ruan? Chen Ping'an asked in a curious manner. The smallest mountain has been named True Jewel Mountain by the Great Li Empire, and the asking price is 1 gold essence copper coin, but it has to be a greeting spring coin, Ruan Qiong replied. Chen Ping'an was stunned. Just 1 gold essence copper coin? Ruan Qiong chuckled in response. Don't be fooled. They call it a mountain, but it's actually just a little hill, and 1 greeting spring coin is a very steep price. The only reason why it costs so much is because the Great Li Empire is unable to ask for half a gold essence copper coin. Even if it's only a hill, it'll still belong to me for the next 500 years for just a single copper coin. No matter how I think about it, it seems like a fantastic deal, Chen Ping'an murmured to himself. Ruan Qiong continued. The asking price for the medium-sized mountains such as Wild Goose Mountain and Lotus Lantern Mountain will be around 10 to 15 gold essence copper coins, while the most expensive mountains will be the Dry Spring Mountain Range, Incense Mountain, and Divine Elegance Mountain, will each cost 25 to 30 gold essence copper coins. Ultimately, what the Great Li Empire wants is not the gold essence copper coins. Instead, it wants to keep the 4 surnames and 10 clans, as well as all of their connections on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. What they're hoping to see is for the backers behind the 4 surnames and 10 clans to emerge and initiate contact with the Great Li Empire. Chen Ping'an's brows furrowed slightly as he said, But Master Ruan, won't I be drawing a lot of attention to myself by capitalizing on this opportunity? Won't I make a lot of enemies? Ruan Qiong burst into laughter upon hearing this. Don't forget that you have a backer as well, and he's sitting right in front of you. Chen Ping'an scratched his head and didn't immediately offer a response. Instead of being irked by Chen Ping'an's hesitance, Ruan Qiong was quite pleased and he remarked, It's good to see that you haven't allowed things to go to your head, just because you have my backing. Go back to Clay Vase Alley and have a good think about what I just told you. Try to give me an answer by tomorrow because the longer you delay, the greater the chance that an unexpected turn of events could arise. I'm not bluffing you here. I'm telling you the truth. After departing from the blacksmith shop, Chen Ping'an was still in a state of shock even as he arrived at the stone bridge. In the past, he had envisioned what it would be like for him to live a life of affluence, but his imagination had only been limited to things like being able to have meat-filled steamed buns and tonghulus every once in a while, repairing the ancestral house so that it actually looked like a house, putting up couplets and door gods during the spring festival, and offering some good wine and pastries to his parents' graves. Never would he have ever imagined in his wildest dreams that he would be able to own several mountains for centuries.